Do you believe in blood over everything, or not anymore?
Thanksgiving. My brother Jason raised his glass with that smug, self-satisfied grin I knew far too well, the kind of grin that said he was about to take up all the oxygen in the room again. My mom, practically glowing, chimed in with a voice that carried the warmth of a Hallmark commercial, but none of its sincerity. Your brother just closed on a 4-bedroom home. Isn't that amazing? She beamed like she'd just given birth to him again, fresh from the womb of her unwavering pride, and in that moment, surrounded by roasted turkey, gravy boats, and forced smiles, I took a long sip of wine and said evenly, without raising my voice or even blinking, "Mine's bigger." But I don't invite people who doubted me. And just like that, the room, once full of empty chatter and clinking utensils, fell into a hush so thick it felt like the walls themselves were holding their breath. You could almost hear the gears in their heads grinding to make sense of what I'd just said. That was the moment I had waited for, not for drama, not even for revenge in the traditional sense, but for something deeper, something that had been simmering for years while they all smiled through their selective amnesia of who I was and what I had become without them. But let me take you back, not to that table, but far before it, back to a childhood where I learned, again and again, that my place was not at the center or even the edge of the spotlight, but somewhere off stage entirely. My name is Claire, and I was the firstborn, not that it ever seemed to matter. From the very beginning, Jason was the sun around which everything orbited. If he got a B+, it was cause for celebration, a proud note on the fridge, a reminder that boys mature slower, so we should encourage him. When I came home with straight A's, nobody clapped, nobody even looked up from their phones. I was told not to brag, that we're proud of you, but Jason's really trying hard, and that I shouldn't rub it in. When he failed math, he got a tutor. When I showed signs of excelling in science, I got told to stop showing off in front of him. I remember sitting in the back seat of our family car, watching him wave around his Little League trophy while I held a first-place medal in academic decathlon in my backpack, unmentioned, forgotten, even by me, because I had learned that the quieter I was about my accomplishments, the less guilt my parents seemed to carry about not caring. By the time we reached high school, I had developed a skill Jason never mastered: disappearing. I could fold myself into the corners of rooms, observe without being observed, succeed without needing recognition. I got a part-time job at the library to cover school supplies when my parents said they just couldn't afford extras this year, and a week later, Jason got a used Honda Civic as a surprise because he really needs to get to practice. I didn't argue. I stopped expecting anything. I remember one winter, senior year, when Jason crashed that Civic into a mailbox because he was texting some girl and trying to light a joint at the same time. My mom cried when she saw the damage. Not because he could have been hurt, but because it's just such a setback for him. I got into 3 Ivy League schools and didn't tell a soul. After graduation, Jason took a gap year that turned into 3, working part-time at a local gym, living at home rent-free, playing video games until 2 in the morning while my mom defended him to neighbors with the line, "He's just finding himself." Meanwhile, I packed 2 duffel bags and moved to another state with $600 and a Craigslist roommate named Denise who stole half my groceries, but at least never once asked me if I planned on settling down soon. I worked at a diner from 6 to noon, took classes from 1 to 5, and then pulled espresso shots in a bookstore cafe until closing. I was exhausted, invisible, but free. My mom called once every few months, usually around Jason's birthday or Easter, and the conversations were always the same: how's school, followed by a quick update about Jason's latest girlfriend, job interview, or haircut. She never asked where I was living or if I had heat that winter. When I told her I had graduated with honors, she paused. Maybe out of confusion, maybe out of disbelief, and said, "Well, Jason's thinking of taking some business courses soon. Maybe you can give him some advice." There was never a thank you, never a well done, never a card or a celebration or even acknowledgement that I had done all of this, the survival, the school, the jobs alone. It was as if my success existed only as a potential benefit to him. I wasn't bitter then. I didn't have time to be. I was busy building something they wouldn't understand, something that required silence, focus, and the kind of inner strength that comes only from years of being underestimated. I knew, even back then, that someday I'd reach a point where their opinions, their selective love, their lopsided loyalty, would mean absolutely nothing. But that didn't mean I didn't feel it. Every ignored phone call, every forgotten birthday, every Christmas where Jason got new gadgets and I got a sweater 2 sizes too small, it all stayed with me, stacked up like quiet debts I never planned on collecting, but never quite forgot. And then, 1 week before that Thanksgiving, I got the email. Subject line, "Would be nice to see you." It was short, almost sterile, just a few lines asking if I could make it home this year. "Jason has some exciting news to share," my mom wrote, as if the mere fact that he was celebrating something should override every forgotten detail of my life. I sat at my kitchen counter, granite, polished, worth more than their entire dining room, and reread the message twice. I wasn't angry. Not really. I was curious. Curious to see whether 10 years of silence had left even a dent in the mythology they'd built around him. Curious to see if, just once, they'd ask me about me. Curious to see whether I could finally say what I needed to say without flinching. So I replied, "Sure. I'll bring the wine." And I did. A bottle of something expensive they wouldn't recognize, the kind you don't bring to share, but to watch people pretend they've had it before. I showed up, hugged my mom, shook Jason's hand like I was greeting a client, and took my seat. I smiled. I nodded. I listened. And then, when the moment came, when she looked at me like I was still the 12-year-old in the corner of the room and said, "Your brother just closed on a 4-bedroom home. Isn't that amazing?" I knew exactly what I was going to say. And I said it. Now let's see what happens when the silence cracks. The smell of roasted turkey, faintly overcooked and aggressively basted, drifted through the house like a familiar ghost, comforting at first, but eventually suffocating. Especially when paired with the too loud laughter of people who knew everything about your childhood and absolutely nothing about who you'd become. I had parked 3 houses down, not because there wasn't space in the driveway, but because walking those extra 20 meters gave me the illusion of control, of arriving on my own terms, of not feeling like I was dragging 10 years of unresolved family dynamics behind me like a second coat. My boots clicked on the pavement, steady and deliberate, and I remember standing at the threshold for a full 3 seconds after ringing the doorbell, listening to Jason's voice on the other side, animated and booming, as though the party had already started and I was just a late guest in my own life. My mother opened the door wearing an apron that said, "Thankful, blessed, stressed." And when she saw me, her eyes lit up just enough to make it clear that while my presence was welcomed, it had never been essential. She hugged me with arms that felt like they were trained for politeness, not warmth, and then stepped aside, letting me into a house that hadn't changed in decor since I was 16, the same faux oak side tables, the same itchy floral couch, the same framed photo of Jason in his high school football uniform displayed like a presidential portrait above the fireplace, though I knew for a fact that game had ended with him benched for most of the second half. No one offered to take my coat. No one asked if I needed anything. I walked into the kitchen, placed my bottle of wine on the counter like an offering, and noticed that Jason's girlfriend, some blonde woman named Brielle with a forced laugh and perfect teeth, was already helping my mother with the stuffing. I said hello. She responded with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Jason turned, mid-story, as if noticing me for the first time, and said, "Oh hey, you made it," before continuing his tale about interest rates, renovation estimates, and how not all 4-bedroom homes are created equal, you know? And that was it. That was the greeting. That was the sum total of acknowledgement from the people who had watched me grow up, who had memorized Jason's SAT score and somehow forgotten that I had once moved across the country with nothing but an acceptance letter and a backpack full of secondhand clothes. I sat down at the corner of the table, the seat I always took growing up, not because it was assigned, but because no one ever suggested otherwise, and listened to them talk over each other about dog breeds, grocery chains, and the latest kitchen appliances Jason had invested in. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. I had learned, long ago, that the best way to remain unimportant in that house was simply to wait for someone to ask a question, because they never did. I watched my mother pass around sweet potatoes with the kind of reverence reserved for communion wafers, and I waited, quietly, to see if anyone would ask what I'd been up to, what I was working on, where I lived, who I was. But they didn't. They filled the space with anecdotes about Jason's home inspection process and how you wouldn't believe how hard it is to find good tile guys these days, while I ate in silence, chewing deliberately, not because I was savoring the food, which, truthfully, was bland, but because every bite gave me a reason not to speak. It wasn't that I needed them to care. I had long since let go of that particular fantasy. But part of me had hoped, absurdly and against all evidence, that perhaps someone would look at me and realize they hadn't asked, not once in a decade, where I'd been, what I'd built, how I'd survived. That maybe, beneath the performative traditions and hollow toasts, someone might remember that there had once been 2 children in this family. But of course, they didn't. They remembered Jason. They always remembered Jason. At one point, my mother brought out a photo album, the old kind with adhesive pages and plastic covers warped by time. She flipped through it with Brielle, pointing out Jason's 2nd-grade drawing of a house, as if it were prophetic. "He's always wanted a big family home," she said, her voice full of nostalgia, "something with space, you know? Somewhere for the kids to run around." She glanced at me just long enough to make it clear she wasn't asking if I'd ever wanted the same, and I took another sip of wine to keep from laughing. Because what they didn't know, what they never cared to ask, was that I already had the house. A much bigger one. A home with 10-foot ceilings, a walk-in wine cellar, and smart glass walls that tinted at the touch of a button. A place not just with space, but with silence, the kind that comes when you don't have to apologize for existing, for being ambitious, for outgrowing the boundaries other people set for you. But I didn't tell them that. Not yet. Because there was something strangely satisfying in the way they kept underestimating me, in the way they continued to write a story where I was just a background character in Jason's heroic journey. Let them keep the script. Let them fawn over granite countertops and open floor plans and flex spaces that would probably become home gyms and then junk rooms. Let them smile at me like I had never done anything worth mentioning. I had patience. I had time. And I had a reason to stay quiet for now. Because while they bragged about Jason's square footage, I was calculating the exact moment to drop the sentence that would fracture this family's mythology at the root. And it was coming. Soon. There's a particular kind of silence that doesn't follow shouting or slamming doors, but instead drifts in like fog after something much quieter, something colder, something so surgically precise that it slices through the air before anyone realizes they've been cut. That was the silence that settled around the Thanksgiving table the moment I said it, not loud, not cruel, not with malice or raised brows or any attempt at grandstanding, just a simple, deliberate sentence wrapped in a sip of wine and a half-smile. Mine's bigger, but I don't invite people who doubted me. I didn't look at anyone when I said it. I didn't need to. The words weren't directed at a single person, because they were meant for everyone. I let them sit in the air like slow-burning incense, and I watched without lifting my gaze as the mood curdled right in front of me. Jason's hand, still hovering around the neck of his wine glass, froze mid-motion. Brielle's smile faltered just enough for the dimples to vanish. My mother's face, flushed with the champagne of maternal pride moments earlier, turned a muted kind of pale that only people who've been publicly embarrassed without understanding how it happened can replicate. Even my Uncle Doug, who hadn't looked up from his plate in 15 minutes, paused his chewing, perhaps sensing that something irreversibly uncomfortable had just occurred and that the next few minutes would determine whether he finished his meal in peace or found an excuse to take a sudden smoke break. I didn't explain myself. I didn't follow it up with a laugh or a reassurance or some self-deprecating remark to smooth over the jagged edge I had just introduced into their evening. I let the silence stretch just long enough to be unbearable. Then, calmly, I reached for the breadbasket, tore off a piece of dry, over-buttered roll, and resumed eating. As if I hadn't just cracked open the porcelain surface of a family myth that had been maintained with the same care and fragility as the good china my mother only brought out for holidays. Of course, Jason couldn't let it go. He never could. His sense of dominance had always been too fragile to coexist with the possibility that someone, especially me, might have done something beyond his comprehension. So he leaned back in his chair, scoffed softly as if trying to regain the upper hand with performative indifference, and said, "What's that supposed to mean?" His voice had that edge of forced amusement, like he was hoping everyone else would laugh along and dismiss what I'd said as a weird attempt at sibling banter. But no one laughed. Not even Brielle. I didn't answer him directly. Instead, I looked at my wine, gently swirling the remaining liquid in the glass like I was inspecting it for sediment, and said, "Just that square footage isn't everything. Location matters. View matters. Privacy matters. But maybe I've just developed different standards over the years." The words weren't barbed, but they weren't neutral either. They were laced with something heavier, not bitterness, not even condescension, but a kind of restrained satisfaction. The kind that comes when you know you've been underestimated for so long that proving otherwise feels less like vindication and more like inevitability. My mother tried to intervene then, her voice pitched a little too high, the way it always got when she sensed that things were slipping beyond her control. "Claire," she said, with that tight smile she used on guests when Jason spilled something or said something borderline offensive, "you bought a house?" There was a hopeful lilt in her question, like maybe she could redirect the conversation toward a safer, more digestible topic, like maybe I had purchased a modest townhouse in the suburbs and was just being difficult about the way I brought it up. I nodded slowly. "Yes, I did." "Where?" she asked, and there was something almost desperate in her tone now, the realization sinking in that she had no idea where I lived or what I did. That she had spent the better part of a decade pretending I was fine without ever bothering to find out whether it was true. "Up north," I replied, which was both vague and accurate. "Near the water." Jason laughed, sharp and hollow. "Oh, like a cabin or something?" I smiled, but it didn't reach my eyes. "Not exactly. The previous owner was a retired senator. Had the place redone after his second wife passed. It's quiet. Lots of space. Gated community. Trees. You know, the usual." I didn't need to say the number. I didn't need to drop property values or mention the fact that my guest house alone was larger than Jason's entire property. The details weren't the point. The point was the shift, the way my mother's eyes narrowed ever so slightly, not in judgment, but in the dawning awareness that she was looking at someone she didn't know, someone she had not imagined me becoming, someone who had built something huge and private, and entirely out of reach. Brielle was the first to speak after that, her voice tentative but tinged with curiosity. "What do you do, exactly?" she asked, and it was the first time someone at that table had asked me anything all night that wasn't an assumption wrapped in a compliment meant for Jason. Before I could answer, Jason cut in, of course, he did, with a chuckle that tried a little too hard to sound dismissive. "Yeah, seriously. What is it you actually do these days?" There it was. The moment I'd been waiting for. The opening. The perfect, golden pause in which to plant a seed that would grow into something they couldn't ignore or explain away. I set my fork down, took a final sip of wine, and met his gaze without blinking. "I run a company you've probably used this week," I said, my voice steady, deliberate, unhurried. "I just don't make it a personality." And I watched with quiet amusement as the air was sucked from the room once more. Because I knew what was coming next. The moment of recognition. The clicking of mental gears. The unspoken question hanging in the air like steam over the mashed potatoes. But I wasn't going to answer it yet. Not here. Not while they still believed they could understand me with a few more questions. Let them wonder. Let them stew. The next crack in the porcelain was coming. The thing about silence, real silence, the kind that follows a truth dropped like a lead weight into a room that has always been padded with denial, is that it lingers longer than most people expect, because nobody knows whose turn it is to speak next, and deep down, no one wants to be the first to confirm that something has shifted beyond repair. After I said it, after I told my brother that I ran a company he had probably used that week and that I simply didn't make it a personality, there was a flicker of confusion that darted across his face like a glitch in a software program. A visible stutter in the performance of a man who had spent his entire adult life believing that confidence alone was enough to shape reality. He laughed, a little too loudly, a little too fast, as if to reassert dominance by sheer volume, but no one laughed with him, not even Brielle, whose phone had now migrated subtly under the table as she no doubt began typing my name into search bars she hadn't thought to use before. My mother was looking at me differently now, not with the admiration I might have once craved, but with something closer to bewilderment, as though she were trying to stitch together the fragments of a daughter she had long since filed away under fine. Independent, not a problem, only to find the pieces no longer fit the outline she had drawn in her head. And the irony, the part that made my skin hum beneath the surface of my calm exterior, was that even in this moment, even as they squirmed and recalibrated, they still had no idea what I had actually built, no understanding of the hours, the failures, the narrow escapes, and the choices that had led me from ramen dinners in a roach-infested apartment to signing contracts with men in tailored suits who refused to make eye contact with a 27-year-old woman in sneakers. What none of them knew, and what I hadn't told anyone outside my very tightly controlled legal circle, was that 5 years ago, after a string of freelance coding gigs and a handful of app prototypes that had either flopped or been quietly absorbed by larger developers, I had struck on something that worked. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't revolutionary. But it solved a specific problem that no one else had bothered to fix, and within 3 months of launch, the user base had grown faster than I could scale the infrastructure. I didn't pitch it to investors. I didn't enter contests. I didn't post about it on LinkedIn or beg for attention in comment sections. I built it. I tested it. I protected it. And then, when the offer came clean, aggressive, confidential, I sold it. 8 figures. Signed, wired, and sealed behind a non-disclosure agreement that barred me from speaking about the buyer, the product name, or the acquisition terms, but didn't forbid me from building again. Which I did, slowly, methodically, and this time with capital and leverage and the hard-earned knowledge of exactly how far people would go to dismiss you if you weren't standing on a TED Talk stage screaming about disruption. My company now operates in the background of most people's daily routines. You use it without knowing it. You rely on it and probably complain when it's down for even a second, but you've never Googled who made it. And that's how I wanted it. I never needed fame. I needed freedom. I needed space. I needed to live on a hill behind locked gates where no one could show up uninvited and remind me who they thought I still was. And, perhaps most of all, I needed to prove, if only to myself, that I could walk into a room full of people who had bet against me and say nothing while letting their own ignorance indict them. Back at the table, my brother was still trying to salvage his confidence, throwing out questions like darts in the dark. So, you work in tech, right? What kind of tech? I didn't flinch. Enterprise integration, I said flatly, because it was vague enough to sound boring and technical enough to end the conversation. Mostly back-end automation for mid-scale architecture. His face scrunched, the way it always did when he hit a wall he didn't know how to climb. So, like websites, he asked, genuinely trying. I smiled, not kindly. Not quite. It was Brielle, her voice small but pointed, who said, Wait, are you the founder of? And then she stopped, eyes wide, mouth slightly open, like she had just stumbled onto something she wasn't sure she was allowed to say out loud. My silence was answer enough. Jason turned to her, confused, and she leaned in and whispered something. His face drained of color. I watched it happen in real time. The recognition, the disbelief, the mental math. The realization that while he had been celebrating a 4-bedroom mortgage, I had been buying properties in cash. That while he had been measuring success by square meters and quartz countertops, I had been architecting a life so far removed from the blueprint they had drawn for me that it no longer belonged in the same conversation. My mother's fork clinked against her plate. Claire, she said, her voice softer now, less performative, more fragile, why didn't you tell us? And for the first time in years, I told the truth without softening it. Because you never asked, I said, looking directly at her. And when you don't ask, you don't get the right to act surprised. The silence returned, thicker this time, because it carried weight now. It wasn't just awkward, it was heavy with the burden of missed chances and things that couldn't be undone. Jason looked angry, but not because I had outpaced him. He was angry because I had done it without needing him, without needing any of them, and that kind of independence, to a man like Jason, is the greatest insult of all. I excused myself shortly after, claiming a call I didn't need to take, and stepped outside onto the porch. The air was sharp, cold enough to sting the inside of my nose, but I welcomed it. I stood there, listening to the muffled sounds of the house behind me, the forced laughter, the clinking of cutlery, the whispers, and I realized that I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't even triumphant. I was done. I had nothing to prove. The game was over, and they hadn't even realized they were losing until the clock ran out. The funny thing about revenge, the quiet kind, the kind that doesn't involve confrontation or screaming matches or dramatic exits, is that when it finally arrives, it doesn't feel like fire. It feels like distance. Like clarity. Like walking into a house that once made you feel small and realizing that the rooms have shrunk, not you. And when I walked back inside, I wasn't carrying a grudge. I was carrying the last word. The rest of Thanksgiving dinner unfolded like a badly choreographed play where no one remembered their lines, but everyone insisted on speaking anyway. A disjointed stream of half-hearted attempts at normalcy that rang hollow in a house where the emotional scaffolding had already collapsed. My mother resumed passing dishes with the forced cheerfulness of a hostess trying to salvage a party that had long since soured. Jason oscillated between awkward silence and performative arrogance, tossing out phrases like real estate equity and smart investments as if volume alone could restore the power dynamic he had watched unravel in real time, and Brielle, bless her uncomfortable composure, kept looking at me like a person who had just been introduced to a stranger wearing a familiar face. I said little else for the remainder of the meal, not because I didn't have more to say, but because I had already said enough, and sometimes the most satisfying kind of retaliation is the kind that ends not with a crescendo, but with an exhale. I watched them pass stuffing and pie as though trying to reassemble something broken with mashed potatoes and cranberry sauce, and I realized that the family I had once longed to impress, to please, to belong to, no longer had anything I needed, not recognition, not closure, not even understanding. They could have all of their assumptions back, gift-wrapped and returned, because I had outgrown the story they told about me, and I had no interest in fitting back into it. After dessert, the guests began peeling away one by one, retreating to their coats and their cars and their own families, each person offering vague goodbyes that avoided eye contact, as if uncertain whether acknowledging me meant aligning with me, and too unsure of their place in the new family hierarchy to risk it. My Uncle Doug clapped me on the back and said, "Whatever it is you do, Claire, sounds like you're doing all right," which was probably the most genuine compliment I had received from anyone in that room, and my aunt, in her lavender cardigan and soft voice, whispered, "They'll catch up eventually," before disappearing out the front door like a ghost who had only momentarily chosen to appear. Jason was the last to leave, which felt deliberate, as though he was hoping for a moment alone with me to reclaim something he wasn't even sure he had lost. He lingered by the door with his jacket half-zipped, trying to summon the tone of a sibling still in control, but all he managed was, "You could have told me, you know." I looked at him, really looked at him, this man who had once thrown my stuffed animal into a pond because I wouldn't give him the remote, this boy my parents praised for mowing half the lawn, this teenager who had coasted through life believing that being liked was the same as being worthy, and I said, without malice or mockery, "You never asked. You never once asked about me." He opened his mouth to respond, to defend, to say something that would make him feel less small, but I didn't wait. I turned and walked toward the hallway, leaving him standing there with a handful of keys and 1,000 unsaid words that could no longer reach me. The door closed behind him with a soft click, not a slam, not a bang, just a small finality that echoed louder than anything he might have said. My mother lingered in the kitchen, tidying up with unnecessary force, as though scrubbing harder could erase the last 2 hours from memory, but when I offered to help, she waved me off, saying she was fine, though her voice trembled at the edges. I didn't push. I didn't ask her to explain the years she spent praising Jason while treating me like an obligation. I didn't ask why it had taken until now for her to realize that the daughter she assumed was doing okay had been building an empire in the shadows. I didn't ask her to acknowledge that for every favor she granted him, every dollar, every ride, every excuse, she had created a void between us so wide that no holiday could bridge it. Because at that point, the apology wouldn't have changed anything. The absence had already become the story. I left just before midnight, stepping out into the cold November air with my coat zipped high and my shoulders loose for the first time in hours. The drive home was quiet, the kind of quiet that doesn't beg to be filled, and as the miles blurred past me and the houses became fewer and farther between, I felt the tension of the evening begin to dissipate like fog lifting from glass. When I reached my home, a sprawling modern structure tucked away behind iron gates and tall pines, with light spilling from oversized windows and a fireplace flickering behind minimalist furniture, I paused at the front door, not because I was dreading what came next, but because I wanted to take it in. This life. This peace. This place that I had built without compromise, without applause, without their permission. Inside, the house was warm and still, untouched by the chaos of the day. I walked past the kitchen island, where a bottle of wine I hadn't brought to dinner waited on the counter, and into the dining room, where the table I had set the night before remained perfectly arranged: 6 seats, polished glasses, folded napkins, and a centerpiece I'd bought on impulse, thinking maybe I'd invite someone this year. But I hadn't. I'd left it empty, a gesture that felt symbolic now in a way I hadn't planned. I sat in one of the chairs, not at the head, not in the corner, just one of the middle seats, and pulled the remaining slice of pumpkin pie from the fridge. I ate in silence, fork scraping against the ceramic plate, the fire crackling gently in the next room. And I thought about everything that had gone unsaid at that table, everything that had built up like sediment over years of missed calls, passive-aggressive emails, and birthdays remembered too late. I thought about the version of myself that used to wait for praise, and I saw now how small she had been, how desperate, how deeply she had mistaken survival for success. And I thought about Jason not with envy or triumph, but with clarity, because what he didn't understand, and probably never would, was that I hadn't wanted to win. I just wanted to be seen. And when that stopped being an option, I built something they couldn't ignore. The pie was good. Not amazing, not homemade, but good enough. And as I leaned back in my chair, staring at the empty seats across from me, I didn't feel lonely. I felt clean. Unburdened. A woman who had given up on asking for a seat at someone else's table and had instead made her own, bigger, quieter, and on her own terms. Somewhere in the distance, a fox screamed, sharp and wild, and I smiled into the dim room, thinking how strange it was that peace could be so loud once you stopped asking for permission to feel it. And that's the thing they'll never understand, not my mother, not Jason, not any of them, still stuck in the illusion of proximity equals closeness, that sometimes revenge doesn't look like a slap or a scream or a final insult. Sometimes it's a long drive home, a locked gate, and 6 empty chairs that you don't feel obligated to fill. Sometimes the loudest thing you can say is nothing at all.